Yeah, so it was really weird. I mean, everybody I graduated 13 years ago. The concept of people being locked in their school. Oh, yeah. But we also have the smoking lounge. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, we did there, sure. Yeah, and most of the kids. That's where the bad people. For most of the kids, I don't smoke. Would just go out the back door. Yes, the teacher would come in, they'd give a signal, they'd give it out, you'd never touch them. Wow. That's why they have the smoking lounge. Forget it. They didn't want this.
Hello, my name is Ted Eckers. I'm the president of the St. Louis Park Historical Society, and I wanted to thank you all for coming here and supporting our building fund and greeting Lisa this evening. Obviously, this venue is a little large for our more intimate event, but it does highlight one of the challenges we have in St. Louis Park for organizations like ourselves to have a place to hold events like this. And that's part of why we have a building fund. We also are looking to establish a place where school children can come do field trips and learn more about their history, where people can come learn about their homes, where we can continue doing our research and writing, where authors from out of town can come visit and do research in our archives, and all sorts of things like that. And so that's why we're on the path towards building a history museum. So I want to let you know that 100% of the funds raised from tonight's tickets will go towards our building fund. So thank you again. As a quick update on our progress, we have raised over $20,000 this year, which we are delighted by. And we continue to have discussions with city leadership and staff about a proper home for the society. If you are looking to get more involved, we always welcome you. If you're interested in the building fund specifically, or just the direction we're taking, or just volunteer opportunities, please reach out to me or anyone on the board. So with that, I want to now introduce our guest for this evening, Lisa Napoli. Lisa was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, has lived in California for about a decade or so. She's been a technology reporter for the New York Times, been on air with MSNBC and the public radio show Marketplace, and an arts correspondent for KCRW in Santa Monica, California. And if that is not enough, her published works show a very impressive range of interests and expertise. Her first book, Radio Shangri-La, is about her accidental invitation to the Kingdom of Bhutan to help start a radio station at the dawn of democratic rule. So if you can't recall your high school geography, Bhutan is the small landlocked Asian country, and it is Buddhist as well, so it's known for its, what is the index that they use? The Gross National Happiness Index, which is a fabulous concept, and catch Lisa afterwards. I'm sure she can explain it a little better than I can. And that is also a wonderfully written book, kind of part travelogue, part memoir, and I suggest you check that out as well. She also co-produces a podcast about growing old called Gracefully. You can find it on your preferred podcast platform. Each episode focuses on a person with a compelling perspective on the changes that come along with aging. And she's also a dedicated volunteer in her community, leading a cooking group that feeds homeless women on Skid Row in Los Angeles. And of course, most recently, she wrote Ray and Joan, which we will focus on this evening. Her book, which was published last year, focuses on the lives of Ray and Joan Kroc and the fortune they amassed building the McDonald's empire. Lisa will be sharing some stories from her book and can talk more about Joan's connection to St. Paul and St. Louis Park. And at about the same time that her book was published, the movie The Founder was released, starring Michael Keaton as Ray Kroc. You may have heard of that as well. And as movies tend to do, they took some liberties with his biography, and so Lisa can also touch on some of those liberties as well. Lisa reached out to us about 2 years ago when she was researching this book. It also served as a very handy excuse probably for Jeannie to dig back into the archives and do more research on our local franchise of the McDonald's. And you can read about that in the most recent newsletter, the Re-Echo, also found on our website if you haven't seen that yet. And of course, you can purchase Lisa's book out in the lobby. It's a wonderful book, and I hope you will take a chance to read it. So with that, please join me in welcoming this fascinating journalist, entrepreneur, volunteer, podcaster, and author, Lisa Napoli.
Hi. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's such a thrill and an honor to be here because I've been thinking about St. Louis Park for years, and I actually visited here surreptitiously a few years ago on my fact-finding mission to understand Joan. And I'll explain why I wrote this book and why I got interested in McDonald's. It's not because I'm a big consumer of it, not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's a bizarre story, and it's really exciting to be here with you tonight in this beautiful place. So I wanted to write a book about Joan Kroc. I'll tell you why in just a moment. And I realized pretty quickly if I was going to write about Joan, I needed to write about Ray, and if I was going to write about Ray, I had to learn about McDonald's, whether I wanted to or not. And I'm glad I did, because I have always had a love of history, and it contextualizes a lot of really important information about mid-20th century America, but also about one of the greatest and under-recognized philanthropists of all time, who happens to be from this area. My story, or my interest in this story, begins on February 1st, 2012, when I went to cover the fate of this curious-looking sculpture that you see here called Chain Reaction. It was built by an Iowa-born artist named Paul Conrad, who really was well known as a Pulitzer Prize-winning illustrator, editorial illustrator, in the last part of his life at the LA Times. And I, as a reporter for KCRW in Santa Monica, I went to cover this sculpture because it was falling down. It's 26 feet tall, made of chain link. It sits outside the Santa Monica Civic Center. And somebody looked outside the window in the city council office one day and saw a kid shimmying up the base and chain links falling down, and everybody freaked out. So they put a fence around it, and they cordoned it off and tried to figure out how to raise the money to fix it. And of course, we in Southern California like to knock things down rather than restore them. And there was this discussion of doing that. And the peace activists, including this fellow on the left, a local guy named Jerry Rubin, not the late yippie Jerry Rubin, decided to lead the march to get people to preserve this wonderful and interesting looking sculpture. So there I was as a reporter with my microphone, and I said to Jerry, I don't understand. Why don't they just go back to whoever funded this sculpture and gave it to the city in the first place and ask them for the money? And he said, turn off your microphone. And he waved my microphone out of the way, and he said, it was an anonymous gift, and it was given to the city by a friend of Paul Conrad's, Joan Kroc. And I said, why would Joan Kroc fund this sculpture in a place where she didn't live? I knew she'd last lived in San Diego, which is a couple of hours away from Santa Monica. How did she know Paul Conrad? Why was she interested in this very pointed peace statement? I had all these questions, and he said, it was anonymous. That's all I know. Maybe you know more since you work in public radio, and Joan Kroc left all that money to public radio when she died. And I thought, that's interesting. Nobody in public radio really understands why Joan Kroc left $225 million on her death to public radio. Presumably it's because she liked public radio. But in all the years since she had passed away, 2012 from 2003 when she had died, I'd never heard anybody do anything except kind of snicker that this McDonald's heiress had left all this money to NPR. No one had ever contextualized it. So I went looking for a biography of Joan Kroc, and I couldn't find one. And so I spent the next 5 years of my life writing it. And pretty quickly, I found out why nobody had written a biography of Joan Kroc. McDonald's didn't want to talk about her. They kind of waved me off. Joan's family didn't want to talk about her. They shut me down. Who I could find of Ray's family, Ray was considerably older and had been deceased for a long time. No interest in talking with me. No archives seemed to exist. It was hard to find her, but I did find a very comprehensive obituary when she died that had a couple of interesting facts in it that made me more interested in learning more and not giving up the ship. early on in research, which a more sane person might have done. And in one book, also McDonald's is carefully controlled what is out there about McDonald's history. And there's one corporate history that was written in 1986 by a man named John Love. And on one page, I should have looked up the exact page, somewhere buried in this book is a throwaway line about how Joan Kroc's first husband managed a McDonald's and later became a franchisee himself. And the McDonald's he managed is right across the street. So that made me very curious. All these little threads of information, we think, most people here are old enough not to think that Google is the answer to all questions that we have, but I could never find out more, and that kept me going. So as I say, I recognized to write about Joan, I had to write about Ray, then first I had to write about the McDonald brothers. And I quickly found out that McDonald's had started about an hour or so from where I live in downtown Los Angeles, across the street from the studios of Marketplace. I moved there 14 years ago for a year and have stayed there ever since. But Dick and Mac McDonald came west. I moved west to work in radio. They moved west to work in the movie business. They came from New Hampshire, and at the early silent era, they were involved hauling sets and driving trucks on movie sets in the golden early years of Hollywood. And they found out quickly, as many people have since, that it's hard to make it in Hollywood. So they wound up moving a little bit further inland and buying a movie theater, then starting a hot dog stand, and then ultimately starting a hamburger stand. Now, of course, post-World War II, I don't have to tell a bunch of people who've come to the Historical Society that post-World War II, this country was developing like crazy. And California, of course, not only was not an exception, it led the way. And people were falling in love with their cars. They were falling in love with their cars. They needed a place to stop the cars and eat. And so the back roads, the previous back orchards of California, got transformed into places like this. So there were many hamburger stands, car hop stands. The brothers very quickly decided that car hops were bad because many of them were women, girls, and that attracted boys and girls in parking lots with cigarettes and music were a bad mix for business as far as they were concerned. They were very straight-laced, conservative New England types. And so what they did is they shut down their stand and they developed a system called the Speedy Service System. And that's Speedy in the center right there. And they laid out on a tennis court, this is one thing in the movie that is accurate, they laid out on the tennis court behind their house an efficient system of food preparation. Now, they weren't the first people to do fast food to your window of your car, but they sped up the process. And this is where it began for them in San Bernardino, California. They pared down their menu from ribs and more complicated fare and made it as quick as possible to get the food out to the customer. And what they did in eliminating the car hops was initially seen as crazy because people love their cars so much they didn't want to get out of them. And now all of a sudden at this establishment, they had to walk up to the window. At first, people were outraged by that, but ultimately they got the drill that they got their food faster if they'd just get out of their car. And they loved it, too, because they could send their kid with a quarter or whatever to go up to the window, and it empowered the child. The fact that it was family-friendly was a good thing. So on many levels, they hit a home run with a business that was already pretty good. They started franchising this business because everybody kept coming from around the country. This is an ad in a trade magazine that was attracted so many people to their parking lot to look at why this place was selling so many hamburgers. And they recognized, instead of just giving the formula away, we'll start charging for it. So they started charging something ridiculous, like $950, and they'd sell you a blueprint, basically a 24-page blueprint for how they did business, and give it to you, and you could go back to wherever you lived and start it and do whatever the heck you wanted for your $950. No franchise fee, no royalty, nothing. In fact, the first person who franchised from the brothers opened in Phoenix, Arizona, and he came back. He was so excited to report how well things were going, and he showed the brothers pictures, and the brothers said, "Why did you name your place McDonald's? Why didn't you name it Fox? Your name is Fox." And the fellow said, "Well, because I want to replicate your success." And the brothers said, "Well, that's dumb. Why wouldn't you not want to personalize the restaurant?" They didn't understand why their whole brand was successful, because they hadn't really intended to build a brand. They just built something that was successful that other people wanted to duplicate. Of course, that changed very quickly. They sold about 9 or 10 of them before a fellow who sold them these multi-mixers that enabled them to make shakes very quickly, 6 at a time, 5 or 6 at a time, depending on the era of the multi-mixer. This fellow named Ray Kroc showed up to sell them or to deliver their latest order of multi-mixers, because they had a number of these stores. They were helping to buy these mixers for their franchisees. And Ray rolled in. He lived in Chicago. He was born in Chicago, raised in Oak Park, dropped out of high school, was an inveterate salesman. He'd been selling paper cups. He'd run into the fellows who had something, if anybody here remembers, something called Prince Castles or Cock Robins in Illinois. He partnered with the fellows who had these little ice cream stands in Illinois, who invented this multi-mixer, and he convinced them to let him sell these multi-mixers, which he then in turn sold to various people like the McDonald's brothers. And so he had a going concern doing this all around the country. And he walked into that McDonald's parking lot to deliver his goods that day and fell in love with their whole system. He was a clean freak. He was a control freak. The brothers were clean freaks and control freaks. Ray was extremely conservative. He loved that there weren't scantily clad girls running around the parking lot. So he really fell in love with this idea. And he thought, if I can franchise this idea all around the country, back in the Midwest and beyond, I'm going to sell a whole lot of multi-mixers. The brothers at first put him off because they had a franchise agent. The franchise agent fell ill. As often happens in circumstance, it just collided together and it worked in his favor. Ray went back to the Midwest and started, in addition to selling these multi-mixers, started selling McDonald's franchises. And he built his first one in Des Plaines, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, which is, unfortunately, I was in Chicago a few weeks ago, and I had to disappoint people by telling them, those who were not history-minded, that their Des Plaines franchise, which is now sort of set up a little bit like a museum, even though you can't go in it, is not the first McDonald's that was built. It says outside, 1955, the first McDonald's. It wasn't. But nonetheless, there's Ray, there's that first McDonald's, the alleged first, it's the first Ray McDonald's. Ray really, as I said, was a salesman through and through. He was initially a piano player. He was a bit of a hustler, a big talker, and he made a lot of enemies. He wasn't a nice person. He was a big drinker, and his biggest enemy was his first wife, Ethel, who really, at this point, Ray was 55 or going on 55. She really wanted him to power down, but instead Ray got involved in McDonald's and went gung-ho. He found a whole constellation of people to help him in this effort, including this woman, June Martino, on the right, and Don Conley on the left, who was a World War II fighter pilot, who was one of his franchise managers, who was making so little money working for McDonald's corporate that he flew a plane in the spare time, gave flying lessons. And Ray and he got together and bought this little plane, a little Cessna, and very quickly recognized that what they could do is fly over the developing suburbs of the emerging post-war landscape and locate sites for McDonald's. So they would look for the church, and they'd look for the high school, and they'd look for the housing development, and they'd say, we need to go buy that plot over there and build a McDonald's on it. So that was one of his early secret sauces, if you will, including these other gentlemen here in this picture, including and especially the man on the right. Harry Sonnenborn, who was his money mastermind. And Harry Sonnenborn had worked for Tasty Freeze. He was as much a businessman as Ray was a salesman. And he really convinced Ray that what Ray was in the business of was not hamburgers and French fries and milkshakes, but real estate, which we all have heard at some point in our lives is really what it's all about. And it was Harry who architected the mastermind behind McDonald's that made McDonald's successful. And nonetheless, and I'm truncating a whole lot of history that's in the book, and I'm happy to talk about afterwards in order to get to Joan. I'm collapsing it all, but basically it was Harry, even Ray credited him with coming up with the formula that saved McDonald's, because in the earliest years, McDonald's as a corporation was doing badly. Everybody who bought a franchise, and by now you were paying $9.50 for your franchise information and the blueprint and the golden arches architecture, but you weren't buying food from McDonald's. You were basically giving a royalty of 1.9% to the McDonald's corporation. 0.5% of that was going into the pocket of the brothers, Dick and Mac, back in San Bernardino, still running their restaurant. And then the 1.4 was going to corporate to help engine this growth all across America. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough money to keep things going. Now, Ray in 1957 came to St. Paul. He was active and selling even as his staff grew. And there was a man in St. Paul, a well-respected businessman named Jim Zine. And he ran this restaurant called the Criterion. Some of you may remember it or know of it. And it was an elegant restaurant. You could get a lobster dinner there. It wasn't a place where people ate, randomly, normally. I found this fascinating. I'm 53 years old, and I grew up in a very modest family. I didn't know that there wasn't a time when people didn't always go out to eat, even for very basic food. But writing this story taught me just how much our society has changed. And this was a very exclusive, fancy restaurant that regular people wouldn't go to every day. And Jim Zine was a very smart businessman, and he'd hired this beautiful woman named Joan Smith to play the organ in the main dining room to entertain every night the guests, the dinner guests. And Joan was from West St. Paul. She went to Humboldt High. She wasn't a great student, but she was very vivacious, and she was an incredibly skilled musician. She went to McPhail School of Music. She took the streetcar from St. Paul to study there. She taught lessons. She was, at this point, when she was playing at the Criterion, 27 years old, and she was also playing on the air at KSTP because Stanley Hubbard Sr. had hired her to play in the musical breaks in between shows. She worked at the Criterion at night. So she had a 10-year-old daughter. Her husband was a Navy veteran, worked on the railroads, wasn't working steadily. So she was basically the main breadwinner in her family. And Ray Kroc walked in, and he, as a pianist too, took one look at this woman who was 26 years younger than he, fell in love not just with her good looks, her blonde beauty, he called it later in his autobiography, but with her proficiency on the keyboards. She was such a good musician, as was he. And he, ironically, had played in the early days of radio, the medium that was coming up when he was Joan's age. He had made extra money by playing live on the radio back when that's how music was transmitted in the early days of radio at the Oak Park Arms Hotel. Curiously, Joan's boss, Jim Zine, bought into the franchise. He'd never bought a milkshake mixer from Ray. Ray'd been trying for years to get him to buy a multi-mixer. He didn't really need one at the Criterion restaurant, but he did buy the McDonald's franchise. And curiously, Joan's husband, Raleigh, was hired to manage it. even though Ray really didn't like absentee owners. He felt that owners who were running the place were more invested because it was their business. That's another interesting thread in all of this, the whole idea of the American dream of owning your own business, and franchising is sort of like a training wheels of owning your own business. Nonetheless, Raleigh came over to St. Louis Park to run this McDonald's, which was store number 93 in the constellation of McDonald's, and the second store in the state. The first one was up the road in Roseville. It was doing incredibly well. Jim Zine's friends thought he was crazy. He's running this lobster, white tablecloth, fine dining restaurant, and now he's getting into hamburgers. But people who got the religion of hamburgers early on, whether it was McDonald's or one of the many other chains that were developing at the time, knew and saw this light of fast food. So this store opened in 1959, and we can talk about it afterwards, all the consternation that it caused in this area, including among the principal of this high school, who thought this was the end of the universe, that this place was going to be built across the street. All of his kids were going to be hanging out here. Everybody equated a hamburger stand with a car hop stand, so everybody thought there was going to be sex in the parking lots. And people came from corporate, including Ray, on the little plane. He flew in on the Cessna with Don Conley, his pilot, and Don Conley appealed in front of the city council here a number of times in the effort to convince the city that this was an important addition to the community. And even though there were many people who were vocal in expressing their displeasure that this was going to happen, breakdown of family values, end of the universe. What, of course, spoke to the city council was the enormous tax base that this business was going to bring into the community. And so I'm so grateful to have had access, thanks to the Historical Society, Jeannie in particular, as Ted mentioned, to review your newspapers from that period of time, which were quite fascinating to see the sort of back and forth and drama that went on that delayed the opening of this McDonald's until later in the year. I think it was June 3rd, 1958, that it finally opened up. And of course, the minute it opened up, everybody fell in love with it. They got over their consternation about this big blinking sign out front, and it became enormously successful. So enormously successful that Joan's husband, Raleigh, was offered the right to franchise himself. He won earned a $10,000 bonus that year. It's interesting to point out that women were not allowed to work inside McDonald's at this point. Unless you were the wife of a franchisee, no women were allowed. And that was a Ray rule that was a holdover from the brothers. The brothers recognize no women on the property, things are going to move faster. Go figure. So Raleigh got this $10,000 bonus and asked to buy a franchise. And Ray, at this point, was involved with Joan and wanted them off in the hinterlands so that he could come visit when he wanted, and they would not be in the big city. So they sent them to Rapid City, South Dakota, where Raleigh and Joan opened up the first McDonald's in the state in Rapid City on Main Street, like this one here. It's not the original building, but it still sits on the same land. That McDonald's did enormously well. Joan was involved in the back office as the good McDonald's spouse, ordering potatoes and other supplies, helping her husband crew up the restaurant. They opened 2 more in Rapid City, and then a fourth in Manitoba once McDonald's started expanding into Canada. And important for our story here, at a certain point, 1961, Ray really wanted Joan to marry him. Joan refused. He went ahead and divorced his wife, Ethel, anyway. And in 1961, he bought out the brothers. He and Harry, his main man at McDonald's, recognized that they could not continue to borrow the money they needed to grow the business if they had the albatross of the brothers and the 0.5% royalty that they had to pay him. So they asked the brothers to name their price. The brothers said, we want $1 million each plus $700,000 for taxes. Ray freaked out because they didn't have anywhere near $200,000 or $20,000 in the bank account. The brothers said, if you can't raise the money, we want the cash. We'll just keep collecting the royalty. Harry went out, raised the cash. They bought up the brothers. The brothers marched merrily along with their money, and Ray and Harry marched and focused on taking McDonald's public, which was the only way they were going to make their money back. And as I say, that's in detail in the book. But I'll go back to the Joan and Ray love story, which is the other interesting drama here. Joan reneged on her promise to marry Ray in 1961, and Ray said he couldn't deal with being a bachelor, so having divorced Ethel, he married this lady, who looks like a slightly older version of Joan at the time. Her name is Jane Dobbins Green, and it was during her marriage to Ray that McDonald's went public in 1965, making Ray and Harry and June Martino and not Don Conley, but a lot of people in the early constellation of McDonald's enormously rich. And Ray was so rich at this point that he went out and bought a ranch in Santa Ynez, California, and he called it the J&R Double Arch Ranch. It was a beautiful 200-acre property. He bought it on a lark. He couldn't believe how much money he was worth. McDonald's stock was like buying Google a few years ago. Place got written up in Architectural Digest. Ray, as a tax shelter, started at the advice of his counselors a foundation called the Kroc Foundation. He didn't really care what it did. He hired his brother, who was a research scientist, to run it at that beautiful ranch property, and they did funded incredibly highfalutin science research and convened research scientists from all over the world at this beautiful property, where they partook of that 24-hour self-serve bar in the upper picture, which will come into play in a moment. Again, I'm collapsing a long story here. In 1969, Joan finally agreed to marry Ray. Ray dispatched his lawyers to tell wife 2, Jane, that the marriage was over. Her family members could keep their McDonald's franchises that they had all purchased if she didn't give them any trouble. And Joan and Ray were married at the J&R Double Arch Ranch, which now was the Joan and Ray Double Arch Ranch, conveniently. Joan was 40, and Ray at that time was 66. One of the richest men in the world. And yes, you may have noted, I know I'm speaking quickly, that Joan married him after he became enormously wealthy, not while he was still struggling to build McDonald's. May or may not be a coincidence. 1242 Lakeshore Drive is where they made their first marital home in Chicago, a spectacular Beaux Arts building where they got the top 2 floors and restored it and put in an organ and a piano, because that was one of their shared loves throughout their life together. They hosted incredible parties here, and Joan got very bored. Joan did not want to be what we would disparagingly call today a trophy wife. She was kind of restless with the idea of being a beautiful third wife of an enormously wealthy man. So she was sort of trying to figure out her identity. And in the meantime, Ray, in 1974, bought the San Diego Padres on a whim. He heard a story about the Padres in San Diego were about to move to Washington, D.C. The deal was falling through. He swooped in, plunked down $10 million, bought the team. He was a huge Chicago Cubs fan. The Cubs weren't for sale. They asked again before he went through with this deal. And that reoriented the center of their lives. They wound up moving to San Diego eventually. And what also happened in the ensuing time is that Joan became enormously interested in the topic of addiction, because once she married Ray, it became clear that Ray was an alcoholic. And in fact, she almost divorced him several years after they did marry. And instead, she decided to stay. And even though she had just a high school education, she became this impassioned person about educating America that addiction was a disease, not something that happened to fringy people who weren't successful, that it was something that could happen to anybody. And she brought in people from all over to the ranch and convened them for what is considered in the addiction treatment movement to be a seminal meeting in 1976 at that ranch. where she laid the groundwork for many people to work in addiction treatment, which at that point was not it wasn't something that was treated by health insurance. The addiction treatment existed. There was AA, of course, but it wasn't a socially accepted and widely available service to find treatment. And she committed at that meeting that she convened. She couldn't get Ray to agree to get any help, but she committed to start her own organization, which she called Operation Cork. Croc spelled backwards, which was a stopper for alcoholism. And she commissioned a series of films on addiction recovery. And thanks to Stanley Hubbard and her long-term connection to him here, she was able to get them, these films, on television around the country to educate people. They were dramas, to educate people about the importance of understanding that addiction and treatment and the impact of addiction on the entire family. She published books. One of them, which is still in use today, is called The Secret Everyone Knows. She commissioned this book from a woman whose pseudonym is Kathleen Brooks, and she worked tirelessly and created a series of public service announcements that she commissioned from Bill Melendez, who did the Snoopy, the Charlie Brown television shows. She basically did what McDonald's did with media to promote McDonald's. She did to promote alcoholism education. And she had the best and the brightest, the access to the best and the brightest, and she deployed it to her in her service. It was an incredible discovery when I realized and pieced together all of this. Incredible in the sense that I didn't really understand Joan and her motivation. And when I saw that she was so committed, she couldn't figure out her own husband's issue, but she wanted to help other people. And so she detoured some of his money in the Kroc Foundation to this cause, and it was really revolutionary, funding work at Dartmouth Medical School to rewrite the medical curriculum in this country so that doctors, who at that point were given 1 day's training about addiction of all sorts and its impact and how to diagnose it, what to do about it, to, of course, making it a much more important thread in medical education. So I think that was a formidable and undiscovered or undiscussed element of her philanthropy. And meanwhile, this is all happening at the same time that McDonald's was under tremendous fire for its environmental impact and its nutritional impact, and the Kroc Foundation was doing this incredible work under Ray's brother's watch about medical research that had basically nothing to do with nutrition, more about fringe issues to nutrition like diabetes and such. So it's a fascinating story, what was going on in the 70s for all of the people in the Kroc family. In 1984, Ray Kroc died and left Joan, one of the richest women in the world. And about 6 months later, a man went into a McDonald's and shot up a McDonald's about a half hour from where Joan and Ray had lived, in a very poor community, a border town called San Ysidro. Some of you may remember this. It was the early days of the 24/7 TV movement. So, of course, this is one of the first calamities that got 24-hour coverage. It was a terrible, heinous crime. And Joan, at that point, was known for her work in addiction, but not known well in the San Diego community. And she did something that was the second thing that really, for me, kept me going as I researched this book. The next day, she called a news conference, and without talking to the people at McDonald's, who were very worried about whether she was going to try to assert control as the largest individual shareholder in McDonald's on her husband's death, very worried about her. They didn't like her. They thought she was a loose cannon. Sorry for the bad metaphor. She called this news conference and announced to the news conference, to the assembled press corps, that she was going to put down $100,000 in a victims fund. And she challenged McDonald's and everyone else in the world to contribute to this fund. And all of a sudden, every bank in town had people lining up to give money to this fund. McDonald's came up with $1 million for the fund. And more controversially, a few days later, she announced that she was going to give the first payout of this fund to the gunman's widow, because she felt that the gunman's widow and her 2 children were as much victimized by the actions of this killer, James Huberty, as other people in this crowd who had died, among the 20-something people who had died in this restaurant. And that, to me, said a lot about Joan, that at a moment of crisis, her husband had died months before, she wasn't trying to cover herself and her corporate interests, that she was doing something that the McDonald's people were extremely upset about. She was also going down to San Ysidro on almost a daily basis and meeting with people in the community there. With the aid of a translator, she was talking with them, consoling with them, and promising them that she was going to convince McDonald's to knock that restaurant down. McDonald's wanted to be defiant, build it up again, show that, a killer can't bring us down. And Joan knew and learned very quickly in the Latino community that that was incredibly egregious, that it needed to be built into a shrine. And she convinced the McDonald's people to do that. That said to me a lot about her character. And from there, she really took off. She was 55. As I said, she was one of the richest women in the world. At that time, the fortune was worth about $500 million. Later that year, in 1984, was the worst and the best year of her life. The Padres, which was a crummy, cellar-dwelling team, won the National League pennant and made their way to the World Series. They didn't win, but Joan got baseball fever. She had said to her husband when he bought the team, "Why would you want to buy a monastery?" And now all of a sudden she was Ms. Baseball, as you can see. She was thrilled about the success. She started investing some of the money that she had in other projects, just to sort of as a feeler. She had met Jack Lemmon a few years before, and basically he had called her up and said he needed money to turn this Broadway play he was in into a movie because Hollywood wouldn't fund it. So she wrote the $7 million check. She became very good friends with the former Saturday Review editor Norman Cousins, who some of you may know had become notorious for having written a book about laughing your way back to health. And that made him an early holistic health guru, even though he wasn't a doctor. And some people ridiculed him, other people revered him. He came to UCLA to start an institute there, and Joan loved what he did, loved him, and started writing him $1 million checks every so often to fund his research. He got her interested in the issue of peace, and she bought 500,000 copies of this book, which had come out in 1985. I might be getting the year wrong, 84, 85, by Dr. Helen Caldicott about the no nukes, or the no nukes movement and the arms proliferation at the time. And Joan loved her, Helen Caldicott, so much, and this book, that she bought 500,000 copies and gave them away for free. She took out $1 million worth of newspaper ads, back when that's how you got the attention of the American public, in newspapers all around the country, decrying nuclear weapons and asking people, back before email, to write into their elected officials and tell them to stop the arms race. This happened on 2 occasions. She did all kinds of work in the No Nukes movement, including funding a song, which I won't play for you right now, that was played at the 40th anniversary of Hiroshima. She had it translated into Japanese and pressed on vinyl and sent to every single radio station in the country. From there, she met Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame, where she funded an international peace institute that's still operational today. Around that time is when she met Paul Conrad, the artist who you saw at the beginning of this presentation, whose work you saw at the beginning of this presentation, and she fell in love with his words and his work and funded that sculpture. They became friends. He said he wanted to build this sculpture when they were on a cruise, and she underwrote the work. It was kind of controversial in both Beverly Hills and Santa Monica. Santa Monica got the work. It was just restored, reopened to the public 2 weeks ago, and it's got a plaque on it now. It wasn't ready for photography because it wasn't etched appropriately, but basically, Joan Kroc's anonymous gift is now publicly known and acknowledged as the donor who made this artwork possible. And it was a huge community rally that made this sculpture, saved this sculpture. Before she died, she built another Peace Institute at the University of San Diego, which is another Catholic university. People think she's Catholic because of her work in both these Catholic universities. She was not. In fact, other people think that she was a salvationist because she gave, before she died, money to build a community center in a very poor neighborhood in San Diego that is a world-class recreation facility. And then when she died, she gave the bulk of her estate, $2 billion with a B, to the Salvation Army to replicate the center all over the country. I think one was supposed to have been built here and it fell through, but there are 26 of them online now all around the country, and they transform the neighborhoods in which they're built. And all of that is a little bit about why and how I fell in love with Joan Kroc. I think her message of philanthropy, she was lived large. She used her plane like a pickup truck. She carted around everything from people's bodies. When Norman Cousins died, she ferried his body to the family plot, to leopards who needed attention at the local zoo, and everything in between. She gave money to flood relief, also anonymously. She was an incredible person who used this fast food fortune that Ray left her, that started across the street, for her in an incredible way. And it's been a pleasure getting to know this woman posthumously. Of course, I've never met her, and to convince her family that I didn't want to do a hatchet job on her. It took them a while to get them to talk with me. But I think it's a really interesting story, and as I say, it's so made more interesting by the fact that we're in these hallowed halls near where her involvement began. And I think that's where I'll stop and open it up to you for questions. Thank you. Thank you.
You mentioned the buying of the San Diego Padres. I think you said 1974?
Yes.
And of course, Joan was from the St. Paul area. Did any of that have any connection with the San Diego Padres signing out of college without one day in the minor leagues, Dave Winfield, to play baseball?
I should probably know the answer to that question, but I don't. But I do know that the St. Paul farm team, name escapes me right now, Saints, of course, was where Ray took Joan on one of their first dates. But yes, I don't know about the Dave Winfield. Sorry, I'll look it up. We'll figure it out together. The problem with this story is it touches so many different tentacles. The whole baseball chapter, the whole baseball era for the Krocs could be a whole book unto itself. And I've read a number. In fact, I know that Dave Winfield, there is an autobiography. Buzzy Bavasi from the Dodgers wrote a book, and there's a thread there. Catfish Hunter had a famous falling out with Joan and Ray, but he really hated Joan. Joan was trying to assert herself in her, what he said was her Carry Nation temperance movement in baseball, when in fact, really, she was very instrumental in getting baseball to acknowledge addiction. They built a pavilion at Hazelden, in part. Joan built a pavilion at Hazelden in large part because she was sending so many of the players to dry out there. And so there's a beautiful world-class recreation center on the grounds of Hazelden because of that. So, but I'm sorry I can't answer that question. But yeah, so Major League Baseball and the whole idea of being able to talk about your needs with addiction, an employee assistance program, all stemmed from Joan's work in that world. Yes.
Thank you, Lisa. Very nice presentation.
Thank
Very
you.
well presented.
Thank you.
A lot to go through. Ted was saying something. I think it was something. You're a peaceful place. I wanted to ask you about. Is it called Bhutan?
Yeah, Bhutan, gross national happiness, yes.
When I think of Bhutan, I think of World War II, the road to Bhutan, It's not that, huh?
Different Bhutan. This is Bhutan.
And
It's
this
a
is
little-
important to you. Why again now?
Bhutan.
Yeah.
I got invited to help start this radio station in Bhutan, which is below Tibet and surrounded by India. It's a country about the size of Switzerland with 750,000 people that didn't have television until 1999. Very interesting. Didn't have roads until the 60s or hard currency till the 60s. I got invited because I met a cute guy at a cocktail party who I was chatting with, and he said he was a tea importer, which I found fascinating. And I was working in public radio, and he found that fascinating. And a few weeks later, I got an email asking me if I would go to Bhutan to help start a radio station. And of course, I was hoping that he was going to be there, but he wasn't. But that's how I got mixed up with Bhutan, and I knew very little about it. I knew that it didn't have TV until very late in the game. And this radio station was the first commercial radio station there. There was a government-owned radio station, and I got invited at the time. I didn't know at the time of the invitation that the king was about to abdicate the throne and convert the monarchy into a democracy for the first time. He ordered the installation of a parliament, basically, and felt that media, a free press, was essential to a democracy. And so newspapers, there had only been one state-owned newspaper, a state-owned television station, and a part-time state-owned radio station. And so because the population is so young, they felt that they needed a youth-oriented radio station to get kids, and kids were taught in English once schools were established in the country. They felt they needed an English language youth-oriented radio station. So yes, Bhutan, not Baton. Yeah. And I've learned a lot since. Happy to talk more about that.
Let me just come over there so we get you on the mic. Hold on.
And the cute guy is still a good friend. Sort of like writing about McDonald's, I had, no interest in really, it was not that I had no interest, I just didn't know knowledge of the place. And it was really fascinating to learn about that region and the place and the time
Hi.
because of that.
I
Yeah.
loved your presentation.
Thank
Is
you.
there a correlation between Joan's Midwestern upbringing, granted it was the 40s and 50s, and her philanthropy?
It's interesting. I've asked her daughter about that. I think it has to do, she even said in a number of interviews that her Midwestern roots grounded her. I think it also has to do with her having grown up very poor. A lot of people grow up poor, wind up very wealthy, and aren't necessarily as benevolent as she is, but of course most people don't end up with $3 billion to give away at the end of their lives. But I think it was grounded in that. And I know she did on several occasions attribute her focus. I mean, in fact, people would often ask her, why are you doing all this addiction work? And she kept Ray's secret that he was an alcoholic all through that work she was doing with Dartmouth Medical School and making these films. And when people would say, you could do anything you wanted to, why are you working so hard on this subject that's, complicated? She would say, well, I think if I didn't have my Midwestern roots and this grounding, that I'd be off running on the beach in Tahiti or something like that. But she really wished that she could be educated, and given that she couldn't, given her circumstances in life, I mean, she got married when she was just barely 18, had a baby a year later, was supporting the family, would have loved to have gone to school. I think it did have a lot to do with it. And it's interesting, when she moved to Rapid City, which of course in the late 50s was very, very far away from Minneapolis, St. Paul, even though of course it really wasn't, she hated it there. But as soon as she left there, she had this affinity. She recognized that the people she'd met there were really good people, and she continued to give a lot over the rest of her life, and to go back there to visit friends over the rest of her life. So she really, she went in this glamorous direction just by virtue of Ray's life, but she was a real real person, too, very down to earth.
You alluded to the film and the inaccuracies.
Yes.
And one of the things that I wanted to ask about, because I was struck by your comment that they were given their $1 million apiece and their $750,000 and went happily on their way.
Yes.
And in the film, they lead you to believe that there was an oral agreement made that was never honored that ended up costing them hundreds of millions of dollars. What do you know about that particular incident? And are there any other things you could point out in the film that weren't accurate?
Yes. So I have spent many, many, many hours trying to figure out if that was true. Even before I saw the film and read the script, I spent hours trying to figure out what was real, because to separate out what the mythology is that McDonald's propagates is tough. I can say with virtual certainty, and I only qualify it because I haven't seen papers, that it is not true that those brothers got screwed out of a continued royalty. I've talked to so many people, and as you probably know, there are many fast food historians. I'm still an amateur as far as I'm concerned, even though I've written a book about it. But there are people who are steeped in McDonald's history who have nothing to do with McDonald's, as I do not. In other words, they have no skin in the game. And absolutely no evidence that the brothers got screwed. And in part because, if you think about it, they were getting a 0.5% royalty. And Ray went to them and as I say, said, name your price. They named the price. He freaked out about the price. And they said, well, if you can't come up with the money, we'll keep getting our royalty. There are interviews. There's a fantastic story about a fellow who was an A&W root beer stand or drive-in operator for many years, who went back to school in Bellevue, Nebraska. And he went back to school later in life and got a business degree. And he wanted to give the brothers McDonald their due. This is about 20 years ago. And he was older then. He's since deceased. I talked to him before he died. And he went to New Hampshire from Nebraska with the video crew and taped an interview with Dick McDonald, which I was able to get. And here's a shout out to not just historical societies, but anybody who archives anything. Thank the good Lord or whomever in heaven that those people exist. So in the Bellevue Library, there's a folder, and I got this video duplicated. And Dick McDonald talks with this fellow for 45 minutes and says nothing about getting screwed by Ray. In fact, quite the opposite. So, and then there are other instances of interviews in the, I'm going to get the year wrong right now, so forgive me, but at some point after Ray died, Dick, his brother, had died. So it was just Dick left. And Dick was extremely angry that McDonald's had sort of whitewashed their contributions over. And I think it was a Wall Street Journal reporter, called him up and did a story about, this is the guy who really started McDonald's. And of course, Wall Street Journal story, zillions of other press from all around the world start swarming around. So Dick did interview after interview after interview. He was the real founder of McDonald's. And it was a great color story, great feature story. Never once in any of those stories, I've read them in various languages, never once. And in the Wall Street Journal, then there was another great one, I think it was in the Chicago Tribune. Never once did he say, so where did this story come from? Dear, not everything you see and read and hear in mainstream media or anywhere is true. It's a reminder. I keep telling people, if you want to have a good lesson for your kids on educating them about media literacy, which, there are people in Bhutan championing it right now too. If you look at my website, watch that movie and look at my website. I'll give you a card afterwards when we're in the lobby. rayandjoan.com/thefounder. And I have a whole essay of all the inaccuracies. And the biggest inaccuracy for our purposes right here is that they say in that movie that Joan was playing piano in an elegant restaurant that her husband owned in Minneapolis. Not true. Yeah. But that most egregious error, and the other thing that's untrue, sorry, spoiler alert for anybody who's going to see this movie, but you'll forget by the time you watch it. They claim in the movie that Joan convinces Ray to use milkshake machine mix. Not true. Not true. She had nothing to do with that. But yeah, it made me crazy.
But you don't know who the source of that story is. 'Cause, I mean,
Oh.
the way it was put up on the film, it was like, this is definitive.
Well, I actually got in trouble with the filmmakers because when my book came out in November, I was out, on C-SPAN and wherever talking about it, and one of the so neither Dick nor Mac had children, but Dick married a high school sweetheart later in life who had a son who had 2 children. So Dick had 2 step-grandchildren, or whatever, anyway, he had 2 grandchildren by marriage. And one of them was under contract to the movie people. So he did a CBS Sunday Morning. Yeah. And we've been fighting because they have no evidence. I keep saying, show me. And in one interview, the writer of the film actually said that he made up a lot of stuff in the film. Because the thing is that McDonald's doesn't let people into its archives unless you're a McDonald's franchisee or someone they want in there. And the contract, I talked to the man who was the last surviving person who was there when the contract was signed with the brothers, giving them the $2.7 million. And this man was counsel for McDonald's, but I feel pretty confident after having talked to hundreds of people for this book that I mean, and I'm not basing what I'm saying based on that one guy, but yeah, definitely, I would love to see evidence to the contrary, and I qualify all of that by saying that Ray was not a nice guy. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see what happened between him and Joan wasn't nice, was not good. And he wasn't nice to a lot of people. He got in trouble with the Prince Castle people, the multi-mixer people thought very poorly of him by the time, I mean, he sort of did with the multi-mixer people what he did with the brothers, which was, sign on to sell their stuff and then kind of muscle his way in. But the brothers knew what was going on. They're not the soft, patsy people that they are painted to be in the movie. And they had plenty of money. They didn't have billions of dollars, but they had lots of money. And the other, I'll say one more thing about it. When they sold out to Ray in 1961, McDonald's was this close to collapsing. I heard a gentleman talking about other fast food history. So many, it's sort of like the .com search engine thing. There's so many on the highway, the information superhighway, there's littered with disasters or failures. And it was the same thing with fast food. And McDonald's could easily have gone that way if Harry hadn't insisted on this real estate scheme, which I didn't try to explain here because it's kind of a complicated financial scheme. And scheme makes it sound nefarious. It's not. And so Harry architected this, and if they hadn't been able to enact it and Harry hadn't been able to keep borrowing money, they would never have survived to the point of the 1965 IPO. And the only reason, Ray didn't want to go public, Harry wanted to go public, A, because that's what you do if you're a businessman, you take your business public, but B, that was the only way they were ever going to monetize what they had invested in this business. So the brothers really, if they had stuck around, it may never have worked out. They weren't. Also, the other thing I like to say is if I sold you my house tomorrow and in 10 years it's worth $5 million when it was worth $50,000 today, that's hindsight. That, I should have known not to sell it to you for 50 grand because the neighborhood was going to gentrify and go crazy. And that's also the other reality of what happened. But it's not as sexy to say all of that. So it's a much better ending to the movie. But I'm happy to talk more about that if you like.
My question is about competition for McDonald's. At least in this market and perhaps elsewhere, there was a chain that was a virtual clone of McDonald's. It's called Henry's. And I mean, the buildings looked the same. They had, if I recall correctly, very similar looking arches.
Yep.
Did you discover any competitive battles between McDonald's and knockoffs?
That could be probably 5 more books. There's a lady back there. I think it's a lady. I can't see very well. That could be so. In fact, there are books that have been written about the burger wars, and there's case law for the lawyers in the crowd about how they enforced the franchise agreements. I mean, it was really hard, especially for McDonald's, which was not selling. McDonald's wasn't really selling anything except, as I said, a blueprint that told you how to make hamburger patties, where to source the buns, how many nickels to have in the cash register, how often to scrub the counters in the bathrooms. They didn't sell you product early on, and many franchises did. That's how White Castle was successful. That's how Prince Castle was successful. Tasty Freeze was successful for that reason. They made their money selling you the stuff, whereas McDonald's was not doing that. And so enforcing franchise agreements, especially in an age before, iPhones and the interconnectivity that we have in existence today, was complicated. And people, in the early days of McDonald's, people literally were coming and sketching out what they saw in the fishbowl of McDonald's and going home and replicating it and calling it Joe's. So that kind of thing happened all the time. There's a very famous case, and I knew that there's a little bit written about Henry's in the Jack Love book, Behind the Arches, and I've seen it written in other places. But the seminal case was in Peoria. A franchisee in Peoria, Illinois, a McDonald's franchisee, opened up another restaurant up the street and copied the blueprint and put a different name on it. I can't remember what it is right now, and started selling tacos or roast beef or something like that in the front. And Don Conley, whose job it was to police that stuff, came in and flipped out, and it was controversial. And it's, like I say, books and books have been written on it. So yeah, in that early moment in time, hamburger is a hamburger, a formula is a formula. And that's what's so interesting too. Now we're all about eating local, hyper local, everything. The early days of McDonald's, the early days of eating out, most of the food was local because you couldn't imagine hauling it in on a truck in a patty that was frozen, that was, came from California. There's just no way. So I find that fascinating too, but I know, unfortunately, top level about so many different things, and the food history part of it is just fascinating. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that later too.
Hi, my name is Jane, and I just want to let you know that I really enjoyed your presentation, but particularly for me, I graduated from St. Louis Park High School, and I just graduated this spring from the University of San Diego.
Oh, cool.
So I'm probably one of 3 people who has a connection to Joan in her early years, as well as, I've had classes in the building that she donated, and that beautiful portrait of her, right by the elevator. I don't know if you're...
Yes.
If you've been there. And yeah, so it was when I read this in the paper, I was like, I have to come. But thinking about kind of my geographic sort of journey, from St. Louis Park to San Diego. Obviously now I'm back here, and then I'll be moving elsewhere now that I've graduated. I was wondering if you could touch on sort of your research process and the geography that you, the different locations you had to go to in order to get this information, and some of what your archival research, what that looks like and kind of what that process looks like.
It's a great question. And before I answer the question, I will say that Joan, when she died, had a very small memorial service in the Peace Garden, the garden behind the Peace Center at University of San Diego. And I had the honor of speaking in that school a few months ago, and I stayed in this cottage that they built adjacent to this magnificent garden where Father Hesburgh, Jimmy Carter, and just a few other people. Pardon? The Dalai Lama stayed there, but Father Hesburgh and Jimmy Carter were at her memorial service. Yeah, there's an incredible lecture series that happens there that she endowed in addition to that spectacular Taj Mahal building. So that's cool that you know it and you've been there and you know it so well. So the answer to your question, it's a great one, is how do you write a book like this? And I didn't know, because my first book wasn't a biography. I joined a group called Biographers International, just to hear how other people did it. And I started going to their conferences and reading their newsletters and reading books about how people do biography. And, you know, in many ways, biography is sort of a snazzier way of saying being nosy. And that's what I was. And especially since I've met all these eminent biographers at this organization who go and scour the many years of papers of fill in the blank famous person, literary person, and, you know, mine out incredible stuff. But in this case, that wasn't possible. So I just kept digging. And, you know, what happened was the Kroc Foundation, run by Ray's brother, before Joan, again, I glossed over so many things in this talk. Before Joan took over the Kroc Foundation, which she ultimately closed down, which is a whole other story, Ray's brother had started it and run it for about 10 years, and or close to 15, and basically he was a meticulous record keeper. And so thankfully, because he knew what he was doing was important, even though it really never got any recognition, he gave the archives to the University of California, Santa Barbara. So I found that archive. I spent years, I don't know if Glenn is here from KSTP. Did he get here tonight? Yes, there he is, back there. Okay, yeah. Oh, they're good. Okay, great. So I spent years trying to find the films that, hi Glenn, that Joan had made, because I knew that they would be really interesting and informative about her interest in addiction. And it took forever, but finally I found it, the Hazelden Library here when I visited. And at first, no one at Hazelden had the institutional knowledge to know Joan's connection to the place. They just knew that there was this cork pavilion. But most of the people there, this is why I shout out to all of us over 50, because we remember things, people didn't know. And finally I found someone who did, who invited me there. I went there, I went to the library. The librarian pulled off the shelf these VHS tapes of these films that Joan had made that I had been looking for years. And eventually I found the masters of the films that were under the couch of a doctor who'd worked on Operation Cork years before, and he was getting ready to retire and downsize, and his wife was about to make him throw him out. So Glenn is harboring them for me, which I probably shouldn't say publicly. But so I kept digging and digging, and I would find names of people, unusual names. So I'd try to find the unusual name. You know, it's easier to find somebody with a name like Peter Wybrow than it is to find, or Peter Amaker, than it is to find somebody like Linda Smith, which happens to be what Joan's daughter's name was. But I just kept doggedly looking, and all the while I was working part-time at this radio station, which is not the most lucrative profession in the world. Fun, but not lucrative. And it became this crazy obsession where every moment of my life I would requisition. I read in old newspapers, I read somewhere that Joan had tried to divorce Ray not long after marrying him. And of course, you know, today that would be major headlines if some scandal had erupted with a CEO of a major company, because Ray was super famous at that point. And I commissioned or requisitioned court records from the Cook County Courthouse. You know, you send in $20 and then they send you back these. I went all over. I came to St. Paul and I had addresses of her homes, and the high school librarian found an old copy of her yearbook, which he very kindly sent me. So it was just wacky Sherlock Holmes, day by day, not on any particular schedule, just shoe leather reporting. And it was really interesting and maddening at times, and then thrilling when I found somebody who was willing to talk with me and help me out. I went to Rapid City a number of times, which was a pleasure because I love that city. I fell in love with that city. And through the Historical Society there, I said, you know, I can't believe that nobody knows that Joan Kroc lived here. And it took a long time, but I finally found a woman through the Historical Society who has become a dear friend, and she took me around to all her mother's friends, women in their 80s, who knew Joan when Joan first came to town, because Joan would now be in her late 80s. And that was it's a whole, everybody says that biography, a biography is one book and the story of writing the biography is another book, and it's true. It's true of everything, really. But yeah, so that's just a little glimpse into the crazy stuff that I found myself doing and financing myself. I didn't sell this book until a year and a half before it came out, and the only reason this book sold is because I read that this movie was being made. And if this movie had not been made or wasn't in the pipeline, I wouldn't have been able to go to my literary agent and say, look, this is valid. Hollywood's doing it, which is sad, you know, but that's reality. So I'm glad it happened because it's a good story. Yeah.
So first off, thank you for that. It was a great speech. I really enjoyed all of that.
Thank you.
And I have a two-part question here, kind of related questions. I think I might know the answer to the first one, though. So the movie, did anyone involved with the movie reach out to you at any point while you're writing the book? And then the second question is, you mentioned that McDonald's, they kind of want to portray themselves a certain way, and they only want certain things to get out, and they wouldn't really talk to you when you try to write the book. Did they in any way push back on you writing this book, or since the book has come out, beyond just, no, we won't talk to you?
Good questions. Okay, so the first question is the movie people. So I had been working on this book. I started in 2012, and we went to sell the book 2.5 years later, meaning I had about a 60, 70-page proposal. Agent shopped it around. Everybody said no. A few months later, I had a Google alert. This is my favorite research trip. Set a Google alert on something you're interested in, and you'll get headlines every day or stories delivered to your email about a topic. So I had done that, of course, on Kroc and McDonald's. And one day in my McDonald's Google alert, about 3 months after my book had been rejected, the proposal had been rejected, I got this email, this Google alert from the Hollywood Reporter saying that this movie was being made. So I called my agent and I said, guess what? They're making a movie. And then a few days later, they announced that Michael Keaton was attached to the movie. And I called him back and I said, guess what? Michael Keaton. And he said, so what? And I said, you dunce. I'm saying, you know why. It's your business to sell this stuff, and now we can sell it. So sure enough, we rewrote the proposal and put in the first line that Hollywood was making this movie starring Michael Keaton as Ray Kroc about the founding of McDonald's, and it was coming out. By then we knew it was supposed to come out at a certain time, and we put that in the first line of the proposal, and the book sold right away. To answer your question, my agent reached out to the film company just to let them know that I was working on a parallel book, and basically they said, don't talk to us, we don't want to have anything to do with you, our script is done, we don't want you to ever come back and say that we stole your idea, we don't, that kind of thing. So in answer to your question, no, I had absolutely nothing to do with the movie people until the end. I went to a screening that somebody took me to in LA, and I met the producer, and later he called me up and yelled at me because I was saying publicly that they made stuff up. Nobody really cared. I don't think he really cared. I think he was just covering, but anyway. So yes, McDonald's did not help me. Wait, the second question was McDonald's never called me. Contemporary McDonald's, basically when I first queried them, said, there are 2 books written about McDonald's that you should read. Grinding It Out, Ray Kroc's autobiography from 1977, and this other book I keep mentioning from 1986. Read them. And I wrote back and I was like, that's like telling me to Google Joan Kroc if I want to research her. I said, well, thank you very much. I've read those books, but I have other questions. I never heard from them. And in fact, at one point I'd requisitioned a federal case. This is a long, I'll truncate it as much as possible. I requisitioned a federal court case, and I was sitting there, and the archivist at the federal archives I was visiting asked what I was doing, and she said, oh, my friend from library school runs the McDonald's archives. And I said, well, why don't you tell him I was in here today, because I can't get to his archives. I have to come do crazy things like get these obscure legal cases to see if I can find any information. So they never called me. They've never acknowledged me. A few weeks ago, I got a very nasty email from the daughter of the PR person who was instrumental in helping build up McDonald's, who said, how dare I say that it wasn't her father. Oh, no, this is what she said. She said, I haven't read your book, but I hear that you say in your book that it wasn't just my father who was the initial PR person for McDonald's. And that was the nastiest thing I got. And then there was a couple of old McDonald's guys from back in that era who, would sort of dance around telling me information and then try to intimidate me for reasons I never really understood because it was stupid. So that's a long way of saying not really. No, I mean, no, it's kind of amazing. You would think that they'd be thrilled. And some people have suggested to me that people were angry that Joan, who gave considerable money to Ronald McDonald's children's charities, which is a whole other discussion, she gave them a lot of money, but she didn't give them all her money. And some people have suggested that maybe McDonald's is angry that she didn't give the entire fortune back to Ronald McDonald's children's charities, which is completely controversial in and of itself because some people say that, they shouldn't be allowed to call a charity after a brand, after a cartoon character that has to do with propagating fast food and all of that. That's, like I say, a whole... But yeah, it's been interesting. And in fact, in some communities that have invited me to speak, in El Paso a few months ago, the local McDonald's franchisee, who's been the franchisee there for 30 years, he owns many, many McDonald's, he's very philanthropic himself, knew none of this because most people don't know all of this stuff, and seemed so happy. He sponsored it and brought out free food for all the people who showed up. So it's been a weird thing. But of course, I wrote this book about Bhutan that I thought was a love letter to Bhutan, and now I can't go back to Bhutan. So I figure I'm doing something right if everybody hates you.
Is there another question here?
One over there?
Just get Paul right here, and then I'll get you next.
Joan, fill in whatever blanks you can about the whys for the huge National Public Radio endowment.
I banged my cup when you said.
Why so much money to National Public Radio? What's the background there?
So Joan Kroc loved media. She was a news junkie. And I think you had another question back there. She was a news junkie, and she fell in love, and I don't mean that romantically, but she often became enamored of somebody, as she did with Father Hesburgh. She fell in love with the head of the NPR affiliate. I'm sorry, let me step back. She fell in love with the man who ran NPR at the time, whose name is Kevin Close. And she met him because she was also a forerunner donor of the hospice movement before hospice became something that we all know and appreciate in society. She was an early funder of a hospice in San Diego, and a man in a hospice in San Diego, which was in a spectacular location. Joan had funded it anonymously. There was a lot of, anyway, she'd funded this hospice, and this man was in it, and he happened to be the husband of the major development officer for KPBS, the local PBS NPR affiliate. And he was dying in this hospice and wrote Joan a letter thanking her for having funded this place as a beautiful place to die. And Joan got this letter and called him, and he was dead, and they put her in touch with his wife, who happened to be at KPBS, and anybody in town wanted to meet Joan. And at that point, she'd closed her foundation. She was giving through her checkbook, not through a formal foundation, and anybody would have leapt to meet her, and this lady did. Also, she had recently widowed. Joan had been recently widowed. They became friends, and long story just a little bit longer, this relationship developed over time into Joan's admiration of the man who ran NPR. So she was not an NPR junkie like you are. She listened to it, but she was not a junkie. She just believed in the power of media as part of an integral part of democracy. And when she was dying, I won't give away how she died, but she was dying. She was surveying all of what she had, and there happened to be a bank account with $250 million in it, and she'd forgotten about it. And she wanted to give half of it to PBS because she loved Mr. Rogers and was good friends with him and loved PBS, and like most people didn't really understand the difference between PBS and NPR, but PBS never returned her phone calls. So NPR got that whole bank account.
That's a good lesson for
Pretty
all
good
of us to
story.
return those phone calls.
Can't make
Well,
this stuff up. That's why I could never write fiction, because it's so good.
So why did she shut down the Kroc Foundation?
She shut down the Kroc Foundation because once she started giving on her own, By the way, Ray's brother thought he was going to run the Kroc Foundation till he died, but Joan muscled it away from him. She started giving, and everyone here involved with foundations knows that there's a very strict order of business in how you give away money. Even Ray said, I didn't know it was so hard to give away money. She started giving away money through the foundation. All that peace stuff started from there. And by 1990, she was so overwhelmed by how many people were approaching her cleaning ladies and her children and her child and her children and the nannies and everybody that she just closed the foundation down and decided she would just start giving away money. It was not advantageous to her to keep the foundation going. It was too bureaucratic. She didn't want to have to deal with the mail, answering it. Obviously, she had people who did that, but she just got rid of it. And she just wrote. Now, of course, anybody in the foundation world hearing that goes crazy, because if she had kept a foundation going or reestablished it before the end of her life, it would go on in perpetuity like the Ford Foundation or the Carnegie Foundation, and her name could have lived on forever. But at the end of her life, she decided she just wanted all that money out, and she gave away 99.9% of it. She had taken care of her family, and she just wanted it all gone, and trust that I gave it to you and you deal with it. And then I gave it to you and you deal with it. She didn't want anybody having to administer her wealth after she was gone. It's crazy.
Thank you, Lee. We'll take
Fascinating.
one last question here.
Well, there is a line in the movie, something about when they're trying to talk to Ray about St. Louis Park, and they say something like that, Joan's got to found a great place. Are you familiar with West Lake Street or Lake Street? Do you know anything about, the location, her influence on choice, location, and so forth?
She had very little to do. I mean, she came here because her husband worked here, but it's my understanding that Jim Zine, the man who ran the Criterion, and his brother-in-law, Sim Heller, came this way in part because it was a community that was favorable toward Jewish families. They were Jewish. They were prominent Jewish businessmen. I think that they'd owned a liquor store before the Criterion, and they owned a number of movie theaters, and they were very inventive marketers. They apparently had cars that drove around with signs on them. And Jim became an internal McDonald's executive, coming up with a lot of publicity, did a lot of publicity on local media here. But they had another site that they'd chosen in St. Louis Park initially, in a fancier part of town, it's my understanding. And I couldn't find, before I came here, I'm so sorry, I'll dig it up. And it might even be in the book. There was another location that they wanted to have in St. Louis Park, but they wound up with this one, and Joan didn't have anything to do with it. And in fact, Joan, at that point, couldn't really have much to do with the place at all, because it was only men who were allowed to work there, unless you were an owner's wife and behind the scenes. But no, I don't think she had anything to do with this. Okay,
All right.
Thank you so much.
So thank you again. So thank you everyone for coming, and again for supporting the Building Foundation. This was a wonderful event. I learned a lot, and as you can tell, there are many books that could be written with all this material. So I just wanted to, one last time, thank Lisa for coming. This was a great honor for us, and it's been great to get to know her and to have a little piece of our history represented in her book. So once again, thank you, Lisa.